So the objective of my research here in Erlangen is to trace and interpret the family constellation method developed by Bert Hellinger within the context of esotericism. This sounds good, but maybe too ambitious. This is really a difficult task, and hopefully at the end of this lecture you will see why is it so difficult. Family constellation method is nowadays something, it's a very popular so-called psychotherapeutic modality. It's really popular, extremely popular in Europe, but also in Australia, in Japan, in South America. So it's spread all over the web, but it's also a kind of a contradictory theory. There are serious criticisms around this theory and method. It's something that integrated several trends in individual and family therapies, and also some kind of philosophical thoughts and also aspects of spirituality and parapsychology. So it's really a kind of an integrated approach. We can also add that there are some mysterious, maybe esoteric elements in family constellation that are psychologically from a psychological point of view, extremely interesting. So it's a part of it is connected to parapsychology, raises parapsychological questions, but it can also remain within the borders of a psychotherapeutic method. And it's also ritual. You will see that there are some ritual elements embedded in this practice, and that could be also a basis for comparison in the context of esotericism. So let's see the method in details. As to the origins of the family constellation method, it was introduced in Germany in the 1970s, as you probably know that, and it's a transgenerational phenomenological therapeutic intervention. It is based on a transgenerational theory, and this is something that is fundamental for the future interpretation of the method. Originally, family constellation therapy or the method aimed to treat the traumatic experiences of the World War II, but later it developed into a much broader psychotherapeutic practice that integrated, as I mentioned, many forms of individual and group therapies like family systems therapy, existentialism, phenomenology from the field of philosophy, and also the idea, what is referred to as this ancestor reverence of the South African Zulus. This is connected to Hellinger's experiences as a missionary in South Africa. I will talk about this later. So Hellinger was the founder, who was a psychotherapist, a devoted psychotherapist, a Catholic priest, also a missionary and a teacher. And if we can believe to the sources, he worked without any significant publicity till his late 60s. And the turning point arrived in the 1990s, when Gunther Weber, the German psychiatrist, managed to persuade Hellinger to publish his ideas and findings. Edited by Gunther Weber, the volume Zweierlei Glück was released in 1993. Later, it was Hunter Bond, an American psychotherapist who transmitted the ideas of Hellinger to the wider international audience. It was Bond who translated and also re-edited the Zweierlei Glück that was published in English under the title Love's Hidden Symmetry. That's one of the most known books of Hellinger. After these publications, a whole, and I use this term now, industry of practitioners emerged. These are the words actually of Barbara Stones, which means that dozens of books, hundreds of books, articles, workshops were organized, books and articles were published, trainings were organized. So it became really a kind of an industry of practitioners And in 2000, also an English language journal entitled Systematic Solutions Bulletin was launched in London. In 2004, Barbara Morgan took over the editorship of this journal from Barbara Stokes, and she also changed the title of the journal, the name of the journal, to the knowing field. And I will talk about this knowing field later. This is something crucial here, the knowing, the so-called knowing field. Actually, it seems that this journal just ceased to publish this year, unfortunately, but until now it was an existing journal with regular issues. So let's see the theory of the family constellation method. As I mentioned before, this is a kind of a transgenerational theory, and according to the ideas of Hellinger, all the members of the family are connected to each other through a very deep and strong emotional bond. Even if the actual relationships are lacking in the family, or even if we address dead relatives of family members or unknown family members, these bonds are there and always there. These family members are connected through an invisible link that exists independently of space and time, and is independently of actual relationships also. So the family itself is quite a huge shift, much broader as it seems to be for the first time. There are some basic principles that were described by Hellinger that rule the so-called family system. First of all, the members of the family are attached to each other through the bond of family conscience that regulates the feelings of innocence and guilt. It's a very strict regulation, basically, and strongly attached, rooted in the system. Every member of the family system has an equal and unequivocal right to belong. That's a right to belong to the family. Parents give, that's the third principle. Parents give while the children receive. The fourth principle, the individuals have precedence within family systems according to the time spent within the system. So in this sense, the parent has precedence over the child. The fifth, there is a flow of love from ancestors to descendants. Thus, a respect shown to the ancestors is required. That's also a fundamental point. And the sixth principle, we are always connected to our roots, while we are also free to live a self-responsible life. Yeah, it's a kind of an ambiguity, but the basic message here is that we are always connected to our roots and to this huge family system. Kind of disturbance within the system and within the principles listed above will manifest itself in psychological or somatic problems, disturbances in the living members of the family, and it will lead to personal suffering. If we look at the origins or the theoretical antecedents of the theory of family constellation, we can find a kind of heterogeneous picture. First of all, what Hellinger said was that basically the development of family constellation therapy was influenced by philosophy, by existentialism and phenomenology. He even tried to, in a way, distance his own method from traditional psychotherapies, and he thought that the family constellation method could be also understood as a kind of a criticism of contemporary psychotherapeutic practices. But there are many roots, quite obvious roots. For example, the idea of unconscious systemic patterns can be traced back to the theory of invisible loyalties of Ivan Göször-Ményinar, who was a Hungarian-American psychotherapist. This is quite clear. It's not simply a parallel. It's there in the theory of Hellinger. The unconscious, the invisible loyalties or the unconscious loyalties are those that organize the family system and in a way determines the everyday functioning of it. There were further antecedents or origins. First of all, Moreno's psychodrama practice that you probably know or at least heard about that. That's a very well-known psychotherapy, a group therapy, psychodrama. And what we see in any manifestations of family constellation therapies is that they are also using these psychodrama elements in their everyday practice. But also we can find Virginia Satir's ideas on family reconstruction and family sculptures too. But besides these elements, psychoanalysis, neuro-linguistic programming, Milton Erickson's hypnotherapy, Eric Burns' transactional analysis are all there. And due to these sources, what we can see here in the case of family constellation is quite a heterogeneous and a very, very colorful picture of different psychotherapeutic practices. Besides these elements, as I mentioned before, Hellinger's own experience as a missionary probably played a crucial role in the development of the technique. He spent 16 years in South Africa, and he actually makes this very clear that his own experiences with the Zulu culture fundamentally influenced his own ideas about family constellation. So it's really a very, very unique and interesting mixture of different psychotherapeutic approaches and cultural approaches to healing. So let's see the practice. For those who are not familiar with the method, this might be a little bit unusual or unique for the first sight, but I will try to do my best in explaining this. So family constellation is a group therapy, as I mentioned. Normally, it's organized with 10 to 30 participants. The main aim of the sessions is always to find some unconscious patterns or unconscious loyalties of the family systems of the participants. And in order to do so, the therapist seeks only very limited information. So there are some verbal elements here, but it's not a verbal therapy. Interpretation, for example, plays a very minor role in the process of family constellation. First of all, so we have a group and we choose, for instance, one client who will be the protagonist in the process. And this one client selects some members of the group to represent his or her family members, both alive and dead family members. That's the first step. The clients, the persons in focus, do not perform themselves in this group. They usually just sit at the sidelines and watch how the participants who represent the family, his or her family members, act during the constellation. What is really fundamental here is basically the usage of space, of the field, what is the so-called knowing field, and how the participants are positioned in this knowing field. What do they feel in their own position? So embodiment and tuning play fundamental role here. The knowing field, the field where the constellation happens, is known. It comprises of different sensory experiences of the representatives. So, for example, one representative can feel, kind of a tension in his or her body at that in a certain position, and that's what really counts in this process. So, the sensory experiences of the representatives, basically, the idea behind this is that these experiences can provide a somatic and emotional access to the feelings, ideas, sensations, or repressed memories of the person whom they are representing. In a way, the participants and the members of the group work as mediums or channels of the suppressed or unconscious family system. Yeah, and I chose a quote here to illustrate the process. It's really a very deeply intuitive process. I quote now, in the silence and stillness of the constellated scene, the client and the representatives are able to tune into the unconscious collective will of the family system. So this is what happens, basically. And interestingly, in most cases, this happens very quickly, very rapidly. It just emerges. In some way, the family system is there in the field or in the air. Again, to illustrate the process, this is from Hellinger to representatives during the first constellation. This is what he says. Center yourself, collect yourselves, forget your own problems, your intentions, your goals. Just notice the feelings and sensations that arise as you're moved to your places. And notice whatever changes in you when others are brought into the constellation. It's important not to try to figure out how you think you should feel in this or that place based on what you see or believe. Trust your body reactions. When you feel different than expected, report that neutrally, without judgment. When you set up your constellation, do it by feel. Actually touch the representatives, take them by a shoulder and move them to their places so that you can feel what's right. And today I will focus on the family constellation method developed by Hellinger. It's really important to know that there are several different variations of this method in Germany and elsewhere too. So I use Hellinger as a kind of a focus point to illustrate the method, but it's worth knowing that it's really colorful nowadays, and there are modifications too. But the basis is something like this. During this process, some trained facilitators also participate, and they help the expression by means of positioning, for example, positioning the members in the field. Or sometimes they are using so-called ritualized language, very simple sentences. I will give you examples for this later. And as I mentioned before, during the process, the client just sits at the sidelines, observes the constellation, and brought into the process only at the very end. What they experience here is a so-called phenomenological posture, as a kind of a visual input. But not only visual, of course, it seems to be much more, or the greater whole. Healing sentences can also support this process, and I quote here that these healing sentences compassionately reflect the truth of what the system needs. Hellinger gives examples, like, for example, dear aunt, you're dead, I will live until my time comes, then I will die too. So these sentences are very simple, sometimes even symbolic, not complicated sentences. That's just simple sentences, what the system is supposed to need, the family system. And as I mentioned, verbal reconstruction, elaboration occur really and usually at the end, but this is also not necessary. So the basis of the method is the bodily sensation of the participant. So, in a nutshell, that was the method. And let's see the potential esoteric contents or links, or now I use the term, this really, obviously it's a mistake, but I'm using the term mystical now, so because there is of course no consensus as regards the proper term to describe this process, and there are many open questions here. But to illustrate this, I collected another quotation for you, and I think this will tell you a lot about the mystical element here, or the esoteric. Grounded in my work with family systems in group settings, this is from Annie Balfour, from Annie Balfour, who's a family constellator also. I have found that a person can represent and speak as if she or he were another person. She or he does not know. Although I have no explanation for how this happens, clients repeatedly affirm the accuracy and sensitivity of such representations. For example, as a representative during constellation work, I have wept bitterly during a constellation on behalf of the person I was representing. I have also felt deep shame when representing the grandmother, and certainty that as the grandmother, I have caused the death of a child. Once the constellation is concluded, I come back to my own emotions. This is very typical in this context. Another example, this is also from an experienced therapist. The correspondence of foundations, as I have personally experienced, can go so far that extremely unpleasant heart problems, internal pressure, rapid heartbeat, pain, and sweating I felt at the initial location disappeared after a slight change in body position. Upon explaining my discomfort, it was revealed that the person I was representing, the client's brother, had died of heart failure sometimes earlier. So these are quite shocking experiences for the participants, especially for those who enter this scene without any previous experience. Really something that might be fundamental and even shocking, life-changing experience. You will see that this whole method is not really integrated into the mainstream of psychotherapy. So we can find this in the gray zone between psychology and esotericism, but it's clear that these sensations and experiences are really powerful for the participants. Yeah. So let's see the possible interpretations, because the family constellators and also the researchers working in this field try to find some interpretations here and somehow put this into a kind of a rationalistic, psychological, or natural scientific framework. Very often they interpret this process as a manifestation of a somatic process, and in this way they delegate family constellation into the field of somatic psychology, in which somatic experiences create the basis of therapeutic processes. And they also very often refer to deeper levels of genetic or cellular consciousness. This sounds good, but these interpretations are not very elaborated, usually, none of them, in fact, and very often they lack evidence, but it's just very natural. So it's as something located in this gray zone between esotericism and psychology. This is not surprising at all. What is a really popular and very interesting further possibility is the explanation of Rupert Sheldrake, the parapsychologist Rupert Sheldrake, who is a very famous and well-known representative of contemporary parapsychology, and he was the one who developed the idea of not the very first one, but the morphic resonance or the morphic field, the morphogenetic field. This idea is very often applied by family constellators, and in this way, the theory and practice is channeled into the field of parapsychology and supported by the results of parapsychology. Another popular explanation might be the idea of mirror neurons. I'm not sure if you know anything about these neurons. It's a few years ago, it was a huge discovery, the discovery of mirror neurons in our brain. It was really a promising one. Scholars thought that maybe this discovery will help us understanding the process of empathy, intuition, interconnectedness, and everything else. Since then, it turned out that mirror neurons are not so fantastic. They are great, and they are extremely useful as regards, for example, perception of movements and so on. But for complex human capacities like intuition and empathy, probably they are not enough. So there must be something else, but it's a very popular thing. Not only family constellators use the idea of mirror neurons, it's quite common among psychoanalysts too, so it's not an exception. And again, a further possibility can be the process of telepathy. Maybe something telepathic is happening here. This can be connected to the idea of morphic resonance and morphogenetic field too. Yeah, but this is also something that distances family constellation from the mainstream forms of psychotherapy, in which telepathy is not really a legitimate form of knowledge, or it's non-existent basically. Yeah. So let's see how the academic research, how family constellation is represented in academic research, in psychology and elsewhere. There are not so many publications here, only few, but we have some. And some of them, for example, called attention to the parallels between some forms of shamanistic practices and family constellation practices. Others called attention to the significance of rituals in this context and the healing potentials of rituals. There is a huge branch of research here, a very promising one, that tries to prove the positive effects of family constellation. Actually, we have very good results here. It seems that family constellation therapies work or can work. Their influence is similar to any kind of short-term group therapies. So we have more and more results that support the positive effects of family constellations. Also, I have to mention that there are critics and criticisms here, especially the representatives of mainstream psychotherapies are very much against this method and call attention to some theoretical and also ethical shortcomings, problems in the system, especially in the system of Hellinger. And this is a huge opposition here, really a loaded, emotionally loaded opposition. And I think in my research here, I will have to address this somehow. Maybe you also know that in Germany, the German Society for Systemic Therapy, Counseling and Family Therapy distanced itself from family constellation in 2003. And that was a very clear declaration. It was basically built on criticism towards the ideas of Hellinger and Hellinger himself as a person, how he used his, position unethically during the psychotherapeutic or the process, and how risky could have been due to these family constellation methods. For example, in cases where Hellinger was dealing with serious clinical psychological cases, and he was not really able to differentiate these and somehow select the patients. So there were many problems, and as a result of that, the German Society for Systemic Therapy, Counseling and Family Therapy just simply distanced itself. Later, since then, I would say it has been somewhat, they were able to regulate to a certain degree the practice of family constellation, and now they provide its practitioners and also the clients with appropriate ethical and methodological recommendations. But yeah, it's still a kind of controversial area with full of debates, actually. And there are cases when academic research, and I think this is the most common variation, that academic research and mainstream psychotherapists just simply do not want to deal with this question, not at all. So they distance themselves so deeply that they not even address this question. Really, there is a huge schism here, I would say. Until now, I was talking about the method and the theory, and now let me tell you a few words about the broader context of family constellation and about the broader context of potential esoteric contents in it, because I think without this, it would be impossible to understand the process of family constellation therapy. And yeah, it's a huge story, but basically we have to understand that these contents, telepathy or embodiment or extrasensory perception or even a kind of a knowing field. So these elements are not unknown in the history of psychology. Actually, they were researched in many cases by many very significant representatives of mainstream psychology. Nearly all of the founding fathers of psychology faced this problem and tried to find some kind of explanation. And instead of this, interestingly, the books or texts on the history of psychology, or the textbooks, especially on the history of psychology, usually, in most cases, ignore these influences. I would say that if we go back to the roots and to the original sources, we can see that esotericism very significantly influenced several thinkers of early and also contemporary psychology, but this is something that is lacking nowadays from the history of psychology, even though there are some scholars, very good researchers, who try to somehow resolve this problem in the last decades. What happened in the last decades? For example, there was some work that tried to interpret and identify the influence of the so-called occult on psychology. Again, a very problematic term here, but this is what they use, the so-called occult, and by it they refer to processes of telepathy, spiritualistic phenomena and experiences, very often extrasensory perception and such things, but basically telepathy. So there are works, historical works, that very clearly call attention to the fact that occult, the influence of the so-called occult, was there and is there in the discourse of psychology. A further element here is parapsychology. Due to some historical researchers of parapsychology and also researchers of psychology, we know much more about the development of early parapsychology. And it's also clear today that for many schools of psychology, parapsychology served as a kind of a background. And it was parapsychology that was able to address some fundamental questions in the beginning, like, for example, perception, the nature of perception, or interconnectedness. A further historical antecedent, and we also know quite a lot about this, primarily due to the work of Crabtree, is animal magnetism or mesmerism. We see today, and there's no doubt, that this was probably the earliest form of psychotherapies, and this was the method that led us to the invention of hypnosis. And hypnosis later proved to be a fundamental element for the development of psychoanalysis and further schools of psychology. And further focus point might be here, and very briefly, I just try to summarize it very quickly, is the collective psyche, the idea of the collective psyche. Today, it's quite clear that some variations of the collective psyche were born in the atmosphere of esotericism. For example, in the case of Carl Gustav Jung, he's the most known example here, but there are many others. So today, it's quite clear that esoteric antecedents played, well, a significant role in the evolution of several psychological terms, even though the historians of psychology are not very eager to accept this connection. It's a good question, an important question, why esotericism could have been a useful framework for psychologists and early psychologists. First of all, and I think maybe that's the most important element here, is that esotericism provided a non-materialistic framework in many cases. And already from early on, some psychologists, some founding fathers of psychology, like, for example, William James in the United States, wanted to fight, and really they fought against the so-called medical materialistic view in psychology, which reduced the human to biological processes and brain networks. So very often they use esoteric frameworks, like, for example, the framework of spiritualism, for the purpose of creating a different form of psychology. The meta-theories of esotericism in that way proved to be very attractive for many of them. And interestingly, or this is also very natural, those questions that were once demarcated from the mainstream academic psychology, like, for example, problematic questions like telepathy, for example, or the unconscious itself, it's also very problematic for several representatives of academic psychology. So they were demarcated, and very often they reappeared in this border zone of esotericism and psychology that was not controlled by academic research, but these elements were able to survive and they were preserved in this gray zone. And maybe this has something to do with family constellation too. This process. And I collected some further contents and points of interaction that might be interesting here. I don't want to talk about this too much because maybe it's just it would be too long, but the unconscious itself was something that was particularly open to the influence of esotericism before Freud and after Freud. We see many variations of a kind of an esoteric unconscious, that it's not this form of unconscious. These forms of unconscious are not rational, are not closed. They are very open, very often open to transcendent and spiritual experiences. The symbol formation proves to be another very, very thought-provoking and stimulating, promising term. Telepathy itself, as I mentioned before. So actually, there are many concepts that are loaded with some kind of esoteric content, and that's a problem that we psychologists do not really address, these hidden contents. And as a result, we see something in this gray zone reappearing very often in a disguised form, actually. There are further points. For example, the riddle of human relationships. Of course, psychology has many answers to the mystery of interconnectedness, or we have this term intersubjectivity, and many others, how we try to express that people are related to each other in a very deep, profound, and also often mysterious way. So there are rational explanations, but on the other hand, there are also not really irrational, but deviant explanations. Like, for example, the Hungarian psychoanalyst Sándor Ferenc, who was the founding father of the Hungarian School of Psychoanalysis. He, but not only he, but Freud and many others were very much interested in telepathy. And basically, he was convinced about the reality of telepathy, Freud too. And this is what he wrote in 1932. Cases of thought transference during the analysis of suffering people are extraordinarily frequent. Many psychoanalysts would support this claim even today. One sometimes has the impression that the reality of such processes encounters strong emotional resistance in us materialists, and so on. So we can I just wanted to illuminate that we can find many examples here for this. Okay, and of course we can collect some further possible psychological interpretations or why the representatives in family constellation feel what they feel. For example, we have a rationalistic term here, like somatic transference. This is a therapeutic term, and it basically refers to the process when the patient projects some bodily sensations into the therapist. Don't ask how exactly, but projects. And then the analyst will feel it in a way like dizziness or headache, so this is something very close to this. But the parallel between the two is not really elaborated. But you can also ask that, is this really a rationalistic explanation? How can somebody project some bodily sensations to another person. What is the way of that? how it works? Another very well-known concept here, psychoanalytic concept, is the concept of projective identification. Really interesting, and it can help us a lot in understanding family constellation. Basically, it's about, again, projection and introjection. If someone has repressed unconscious parts of the self, and that person is not very healthy in a psychological sense, then it's very likely that person will project to those parts into another person, and the other person will identify with these contents. For example, he or she will behave violently, even though that violence doesn't belong to his or her self and personality. I'm not sure if this is clear or not, but so these are just alternative explanations. We have the explanations, we can use them, but there are some doubting scholars, like, for example, Nikita Brotman, who wrote a book on, the title of the book was The Phantoms of the Clinic. And in this book, she claims that, oh, look, we are talking about parapsychology here. We are using other terms, not telepathy, not extrasensory perception. We change the terms to look more scientific, but basically we are dealing with parapsychological questions. This is a radical idea, and but very popular among those psychoanalysts who are interested in parapsychology. That was my summary, basically. You can see that we could explain this process, but do we really need to explain? I'm not sure, and I'm also not sure about the term, the usage of the term esoteric and esotericism here in this context, but I'm sure that you will help me in this respect too. So what I thought might be a good option or next step is a kind of a comparison here. Comparison, for example, a comparison of practices. Maybe I could do, and I plan to conduct interviews with practitioners, family constellators, and as a kind of a control group with the psychodrama practitioners. They are very, as methods, they are more or less similar, but for example, I know about the Hungarian psychodynamic psychodrama practitioners that they are very much against family constellation, and it would be nice to see, the main differences in their approach, and also the demarcational lines here, because maybe this would help us to understand much better the practice of family constellation and to illuminate this interaction between esotericism and psychology. That would be one option, but I'm very much interested in your opinions too. Another option could be to compare theories that are, again, close to the theory of family constellation, since they are also talking about transgenerational issues or transgenerational traumas. And just let me give you one example. This is probably not very well known here. This is the theory of Leopold Sondy, the Hungarian Leopold Sondy, who was the founder of so-called fate analysis. Fate analysis is really about fate, and it's basically the core concept of the theory is the concept of the family unconscious. It was Sondy who coined this concept. It's a variation of the collective unconscious. It's not really like collective unconscious in a Jungian sense, but it's a narrower but still collective that applies to the family. That's the family unconscious. And if we look at Hellinger's method, we can see that he's also dealing with a kind of a family unconscious here. Sondy, the theory of Sondy is extremely heterogeneous. He was a psychiatrist, an endocrinologist, a physician, also a forensic expert, and so he was really a talented person, and tried to integrate his ideas on fate analysis with the current discoveries of natural sciences, especially genetics. And he was able to, this happened in the early years of the 20th century, but he was able to develop a theory in which genetics were connected to the idea of the family unconscious. this theory is still used in Hungary, but not always. Not only in Hungary, but also elsewhere. In the world, like for example in Switzerland or in Belgium, it's quite a well-known theory there. And as for myself, I would say that this sounds a little bit too ambitious, maybe to connect everything. I mean, this family unconscious, the level of the family unconscious with genetics, but the theory itself can be quite convincing, especially if we take into account that somebody was able to create a personality test based on this idea of the family unconscious. And the personality test, the so-called zombie test, contains pictures. You can see all the pictures here. Well, I shouldn't show this to you, but sorry. Yes, so the pictures. And the experimental subject's test is a very easy one. During the test, he or she has to collect the pictures that or she likes and those that he or she dislikes. So the most likable and the most dislikable pictures must be selected. And interestingly, based on this selection, this is a long process. At the end, we get a full personality profile of the person. And I wouldn't be so enthusiastic if I wouldn't have the personal experience with the test. It's really a long process to learn this. These things are very, very complicated. But again, maybe we can see here a variation of the theory, original theory of Hellinger based on the idea of family constellation. Family unconscious. And what is really new here, even though the test was born earlier, but what is an excellent possibility here is that we can measure the so-called family unconscious. I know it sounds mystical. It's probably that's too much for the first time. But I'm happy to talk about this later, and I'm also open to discuss the possibilities that if this theory is somehow also links to esotericism or the ideas behind this seemingly naturalistic theory. Yeah, so this is a further possibility of comparison for the future. After this, I arrived to the huge question. Really, I'm not sure about anything anymore. So the question is that can we really identify esoteric practices in the family constellation method? Yeah, I would say yes, but still it's still an open question from my part. For example, I'm not sure if these esoteric contents are really connected to telepathy or just simply to the idea or supposition of the family collective unconscious and family unconscious, or to the personal experiences of the participants. Simply, in that case, we should just remain on the subjective level and not and shouldn't go further. Or, of course, we cannot ignore here that in many cases the participants experience the revival of dead relatives here. And this is truly spiritualistic and extremely shocking for the participants, really touching and moving. And above all, we obviously see some ritual elements here. What is also clear that there is no real secrecy here because, yeah, you can attend family constellation workshop whenever you want to. So, and you can also learn that, you can read a lot about this, so there's no secrecy. But obviously, I would say that this might be a further manifestation of the interaction between psychology and esotericism, and taking into account the extreme popularity of the method, this must be researched, obviously, must be researched not only from the angle of esotericism, but also from the angle of, from the point of view of psychology and psychotherapies. Yeah, and just these are not really concluding remarks, just vague ideas of my part. So I don't have a proper conclusion. This is really a work in process, but maybe it's worth thinking about the possible comparisons here. So what we can see that the family constellation method really hybridizes some kind of scientific or psychological terms and esoteric contents, so it might be a good example of that. What we can also research here is the interesting and very intensive process of inclusion and exclusion, how the representatives of mainstream psychology react on this. Is there any reaction at all, or do they just distance themselves? So these are huge questions. The question of demarcation and boundary works are obviously here, and I think the examination, the research of these questions might be very useful for the further research on the demarcation of problems of psychology in general. And what we can also add here is that obviously there's a form of resilience here, not only in the case of family constellation, but also if we take into account the huge history of these human experiences and how these experiences were demarcated, ignored, or criticized by many scholars of psychology, and still they survive. They are there. Sometimes we find them in a disguised form, using seemingly scientific language covered by this language, but sometimes they are very openly there. And yes, this obviously means that we cannot just get rid of these contents if we are dealing with psychological questions and human function. So, yeah, I think this is what I wanted to tell you today, and thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your suggestions and questions.